The wind across the steppe was colder than death, howling through the grasslands like a living thing. Beneath a sky so vast it seemed to swallow the world, the horsemen of Genghis Khan rode with banners snapping in the wind, their armour darkened with blood, their eyes glinting with the wild certainty of men who believed they were chosen by the heavens. The year was 1219, and the Mongol hordes had begun their march into the lands of Khwarezm, a campaign that would mark one of the most merciless conquests in human history. The prisoners they took never forgot the sound of those hooves, the endless thunder that preceded ruin. Genghis Khan had built his empire upon discipline and terror, upon a code of law so precise it could inspire obedience even in the conquered, and yet his justice was a blade that never dulled. To his followers he was a prophet of destiny. To his enemies he was the end of the world itself. Cities that dared resist him were wiped clean from the earth, and those who surrendered too late learned what mercy meant to a man who believed mercy was weakness. When his armies reached the cities of the Khwarezm Empire, the walls that had stood for centuries began to tremble. The merchants, scholars, and families who once believed in the safety of their gates now stared into the endless horizon, where black banners flickered like shadows of doom. The Mongols did not besiege as others did. They encircled, suffocated, and dismantled. Their discipline was perfect, their ruthlessness absolute. When the gates finally fell, silence followed, the kind that comes before the storm of screams. The Mongols moved through the streets like a tide of vengeance, cutting down any who resisted, capturing those who did not. The prisoners were gathered in squares, bound with ropes made of twisted horsehair, their eyes wild with disbelief. If you wish to uncover more stories like this, stories buried beneath the dust of time and soaked in the truth of human cruelty and power, then subscribe to the channel and like this video, because history is not only the story of kings and empires, it is the echo of what they did to those who stood in their way. When the first cities fell, Otrar, Bukhara, Samarkand, the punishments began. Genghis Khan did not kill for pleasure, he killed for order. He understood that fear was the most efficient weapon ever forged. A city destroyed was not merely a victory, it was a message, a warning that crossed mountains and deserts faster than any army. Those who defied him did not simply die, they were made into examples that would haunt the survivors forever. In Bukhara, when the gates opened and the city surrendered, Genghis Khan rode to the Great Mosque, dismounted, and ordered his generals to empty the treasury. He looked upon the gathering of the city's leaders and said, "If you had not committed great sins, the Almighty would not have sent a punishment like me upon you." His words were not shouted, only spoken, but they spread through the city like a curse. The scholars were executed, the nobles stripped and humiliated, and the common people driven from their homes. The prisoners, thousands of them, were divided by craft, by rank, by usefulness. The blacksmiths and artisans were spared, carried east to serve the Mongol Empire. The soldiers and the men of letters were not so fortunate. They were slaughtered in groups, each wave forced to dig the graves of the next. The Mongols had perfected the art of punishment, not as cruelty, but as policy. Cities that resisted were erased from existence. In Nishapur, when a Mongol commander was killed during the siege, Genghis Khan ordered retribution so absolute that the city ceased to exist in more than name. The women and children were killed, the animals slaughtered, the walls levelled to dust. The prisoners were made to carry out their own execution, digging trenches, piling bodies, and setting the fires that consumed their kin. The ground itself turned to ash. And yet, even amid such terror, there was method. Genghis Khan's cruelty was not born from madness, it was an instrument of control. His laws, known as the yasa, demanded obedience, loyalty, and discipline above all else. Those who defied him once could be forgiven. Those who defied him twice vanished from the earth. When the city of Urgench resisted, it sealed its own fate. The siege lasted longer than most, and the Khan grew impatient. When the walls finally fell, he ordered that the entire population, men, women, children, be gathered outside the gates, The prisoners were counted, divided and then distributed among the Mongol regiments. Each soldier was commanded to execute a set number, ensuring that no one could claim mercy, no one could turn away. The ground was red for miles. The Mongols believed the Khan's will was divine. To question it was treason not only to the empire, but to heaven itself. And so they obeyed, carrying out acts that made the earth itself seem to weep. The prisoners who survived the slaughter were used for work so brutal it defied imagination, dragging the stones of their own cities to build the roads that led the Mongols deeper into Persia, laying bricks for the empire that had destroyed their world. At night the screams carried over the desert winds, mingling with the cries of the dying and the distant songs of the Mongol campfires. The Khan himself sat in silence, his face carved from stone, his gaze fixed upon the horizon. He did not speak of mercy or regret. To him this was the natural order of conquest. The strong devoured the weak, and the weak remembered their conquerors in silence. And yet among his generals there were whispers. Some said that when Genghis Khan rode alone at night, he sometimes looked back toward the ruins, that he was haunted by the sound of his own victories. Others said that he was beyond such weakness, that the Khan's soul was iron, and that compassion was a disease he had long since killed within himself. The prisoners who remained alive after his campaigns told stories that blurred the line between horror and legend. Some said they had seen entire populations blinded and sent east, each holding the shoulder of the man before him, walking into exile through the endless sands. Others swore that the Khan had buried captives alive beneath the walls of cities yet to be built, believing that the spirits of the dead would strengthen the foundations. Whatever the truth, one thing was certain: no one who faced him forgot. When word of his conquests reached the far kingdoms of Europe, even kings trembled. The Mongols were not an army that could be reasoned with, not an empire that negotiated peace. They were a force of nature, a storm that erased the landscape it touched. And for those who dared to resist, the fate of the prisoners stood as a warning carved in blood and bone. Genghis Khan ruled not only through strength, but through fear that crossed oceans. The memory of what he did to the captured lingered long after their bodies were gone. Even centuries later, when the fires had cooled and the cities had been rebuilt, mothers would still whisper his name to frighten their children into obedience. The empire he forged stretched from the Pacific to the Black Sea, from the frozen forests of Russia to the sands of Persia. Yet beneath that vastness lay the bones of millions who had stood in his way. For every city that bent the knee, 10 others had been burned to dust. For every surrender there was a massacre that followed. The Khan understood something that few rulers ever grasped, that terror was not a consequence of war, but its most powerful tool. It built empires faster than armies. It silenced rebellions before they began, and it etched his name into the world with fire. And as the Mongol banners rose higher over the ruins of yet another fallen city, the wind carried the whispers of the dying, a warning that the world would never forget what Genghis Khan did to his prisoners. The fires burned for days after the fall of Urgench, the smoke rising in black pillars that blotted out the sun. The city that had once glittered with turquoise domes and markets filled with the scent of saffron and silk was gone, replaced by a wasteland of rubble and charred earth. The cries of the living had faded into silence, and only the crackle of fire and the hiss of the wind remained. It was said that the Khan himself rode through the ashes without a word, his expression calm, his eyes reflecting nothing but the certainty of his own purpose. To him this was not cruelty, it was order, the cleansing of disobedience, the reshaping of the world through terror and submission. When news of his wrath reached the surviving cities of Khwarezm, panic spread faster than his army could march. Some leaders chose to surrender before a single arrow was fired. They sent tribute, gold and hostages to spare themselves the fate of Urgench. Yet even those who surrendered early did not escape unscarred. The Mongols were meticulous in their punishment. The governors who had once defied them were executed publicly. Their families were enslaved, The craftsmen and engineers were separated from their kin and sent to Mongolia to serve the empire. The rest were divided into ranks: the useful, the expendable, and the condemned. The condemned met the same end everywhere the Mongols went. Some were crushed beneath the hooves of horses, others used as targets for Mongol archers who competed to see whose arrows could kill the most men with a single shot. In one city, the prisoners were laid out in a field, and the Mongols practiced their cavalry maneuvers, cutting through them in lines until the plain itself seemed to breathe with blood. To the Mongols, death was not an act of cruelty, but a form of discipline. Every execution served as a lesson to those who watched, a living reminder of what defiance cost. In the camp of the Khan, silence ruled. His soldiers spoke little in his presence. When he gave an order, it was obeyed without question, for disobedience was punished as swiftly among his own as among his enemies. Yet his justice was precise. A thief who stole from a soldier might lose his life, but a soldier who failed to protect his commander would lose the lives of his entire family. There was no greater crime in the Mongol ranks than cowardice, and so the Khan built his empire not only on fear of the enemy, but on fear of failure within. The prisoners who were spared execution were given work that few survived for long. They were driven to rebuild roads, to repair bridges, to drag siege engines across deserts and mountains. They ate what the horses would not, slept beneath the open sky, and laboured under the whip until exhaustion silenced them. The Mongols did not waste lives for cruelty's sake, but neither did they value them beyond utility. Those who collapsed were left where they fell, their bodies to be devoured by wolves or buried beneath the sand. Genghis Khan himself rarely witnessed these punishments. He preferred to move ahead of his armies, scouting the next campaign, planning the next conquest. He saw the world not in terms of men but of maps, of lines to be crossed and territories to be claimed. Yet he understood the power of fear better than any man alive. He knew that a single story of horror could conquer 1,000 villages more effectively than 1,000 soldiers. When the Khan turned his eyes westward, toward Persia and beyond, he sent envoys ahead to demand submission. Their message was always the same: surrender, and you may live. Resist, and you will vanish from history. Some cities believed him and opened their gates. Others did not. The ones that resisted became cautionary tales. In Merv, when the defenders refused to yield, Genghis Khan ordered the entire population to be executed. Chroniclers later wrote that 700,000 souls perished there, though no one could count the dead. The prisoners were lined up in groups of hundreds. Each Mongol soldier assigned a number to kill. When the task was done, the city was silent, its walls blackened with smoke, its wells filled with corpses. Such acts of destruction spread like wildfire across Asia. Town after town surrendered without a fight, terrified by the legends that followed the Mongol banners. Yet even surrender could not guarantee survival. In some cases, the Khan spared the rulers but executed their armies. In others, he spared the soldiers but enslaved the rulers' families. There was no pattern, no mercy, only the certainty that resistance meant extinction. Historians would later struggle to understand him. This man who united tribes and created laws that valued loyalty and justice, yet unleashed horrors that defied comprehension. To his followers, he was a god chosen by the eternal blue sky to rule the earth. To his enemies, he was the scourge of mankind, the shadow that devoured cities. And yet perhaps both were true. The Mongols were not without belief. They prayed to the sky, to the eternal heaven they called Tengri, and they believed that Genghis Khan was its living instrument. Every city that fell was not destruction but purification. Every life taken was an offering to balance the world. And the prisoners? The countless faces that vanished beneath the hooves of horses and the fall of swords were the sacrifices that built an empire. There were stories told by the few who escaped. One spoke of prisoners buried alive beneath city gates so that their souls might guard the Khan's conquests. Another told of musicians forced to play while their families were executed before them, their trembling hands plucking the strings as the air filled with screams. Some whispered of entire cities drowned in their own blood, their rivers running red for days. Whether all of it was true hardly mattered. The legend itself was enough. The terror of Genghis Khan travelled faster than his armies, carried by merchants, wanderers, and refugees who spoke his name with trembling lips. His reputation became its own weapon, a storm that broke the will of nations long before his horsemen arrived. But even the greatest conquerors cannot escape the weight of what they build. In the years that followed his campaigns, as the empire stretched beyond the imagination of any before him, there were moments when even the Khan paused. Some said he began to speak more often of the sky, of the silence of the wind, of the price of power. Others claimed he grew restless, unsatisfied by the vastness he had won, haunted by something no one could name. When he died in 1227, the world did not know at first. His death was kept secret, hidden from his enemies, and even from some of his allies. His body was carried back to Mongolia under cover of darkness. The soldiers who escorted him, killing every soul they met along the way to preserve the secret. He was buried in an unmarked grave, somewhere in the sacred mountains, surrounded by the bones of the men who had built his empire and the ghosts of those who had perished beneath it. The empire endured for generations, expanding even after his death, carried forward by his sons and grandsons who ruled in his name. But the memory of what he had done to his prisoners, the massacres, the punishments, the endless tide of death, became a legacy that no empire could cleanse. For centuries, in the cities that had once burned under his command, his name remained a curse whispered in fear. Yet history is not simple. It remembers him as both the destroyer and the creator, the man who united the tribes of the steppe, opened the Silk Road, and built the largest contiguous empire the world has ever seen. But beneath those triumphs lies the truth that power built on terror always carried a shadow. The greatness of his conquests was written in the suffering of those who fell before him, and their silence remains the foundation upon which his legend stands. Even now the stories endure, the prisoners crushed beneath horses, the captives buried alive, the blinded marches into exile. They are not tales of glory, but reminders of how far men will go in pursuit of dominion. And so when we speak of Genghis Khan, we must remember not only the empire he created, but the countless lives he extinguished to build it. His victories reshaped the world, his terror rewrote its memory, and his name still drifts upon the wind of the steppe, a whisper of conquest, cruelty, and the endless hunger for control. If this story stirred you, if it made you see history not as myth, but as the echo of real human cost, then subscribe to the channel and like the video. Because every time we remember the truth behind the glory, we give a voice to those who are never allowed to speak.